is hugely important. The 11.6 billion was an important commitment, and I want to do all we can to continue with that funding. We're obviously coming to the end of that cycle, but I'm satisfied that we will be continuing to be an important leader on climate, and particularly on climate finance, and that's why I was very pleased to be with the Chancellor on this issue, and I hope as we get to October also, and Washington DC, I hope I can play a bigger role alongside the Chancellor to absolutely play our part in relation to climate finance. Everybody is saying also, with changes that they're seeing in the United States, that the City of London is the place for climate finance. We recognise that, and therefore there's more that we can do.
And you spoke earlier about BII. Is encouraging BII to take an active role in, I don't know, blue bonds, green bonds, different forms of climate finance? Is that something that you're in discussion with them over?
It is something under consideration.
And one point, I actually got clarity. I couldn't understand why, and I'm a big fan of BII, even though they might not think that, why they got quite a considerable uplift when other areas were getting reductions or being cut. And you were talking about the shift from being a donor to an investor. So I'm assuming that, and you were talking about economic growth is the only way out of poverty. So I'm assuming that that's why they got the uplift. But BII tends to invest in middle income countries, and it tends to be the more stable countries that are able to take that sort of investment. Is there still a priority in your mind for the poorest of the poor, that we will be supporting them to get close to being in a position that they could take economic investment?
Well, actually 60% of their portfolio is in Africa.
Yes, that's right.
I announced a 50 million Africa Resilience Investment Facility specifically for low-income countries at the G20 in South Africa back in February. And just two statistics that have stood out to me that have really affected me. Despite all that's been spent on development by the Global West, 50% of Africans still do not have access to electricity.
Exactly.
And so you've got to ask, could we have done more in the past in relation to finance and energy? And I think the answer is yes, as a Western community, to alleviate that. And certainly should we be doing more in the future to bring that down. And it's still the case that only 3% of climate finance is available to African economies. So that's why I also say, and the committee has pressed this morning, as I understand it's your right to do, and I would if I was sitting on the committee. But let's be clear that if 50% of Africans have not got access to even electricity, for all that we're attempting to do in education, for all that we're attempting to do for women and girls, how does that affect women and girls? Profoundly. There is more to do, and that is why when African leaders say, no, what we want from you is economic growth, please. What we want you is to support us with jobs. What we want you to do is do UK, thank you for what you're doing on trade in Africa, but could you do more? I get it. I absolutely get it, because the answer must be that we could do more, which is the new model that we're moving to. When Mr. Reid asks about vision, that is the vision. Technical skills, better support on energy, better support on climate and climate finance. That is what the continents say they want. Economic growth, the same that we want for our own constituents.
You'll be very keen to read our forthcoming report on community energy. And we have been really impressed with some of the micro businesses that have benefited from having their own source of energy. But one of the comments that we keep on getting is BII, other development institutes, the scale of their investment is to such a point that it rules out a lot of those little sort of start-up businesses and locations and areas where really we're talking tiny financial investment to enable them to sort of get their egg business off the ground. So if I can urge you to also be looking at the poorest of the poor and the initiatives that we can be doing, whether that's bilateral or encouraging the multilaterals to do more. It seems, whilst difficult to find the investments for BII that are ready and that meet their terms, there are many, many tiny ones that are not even getting a look in on that stage. So anything you can do, Foreign Secretary, I'd be hugely grateful
That's
for.
why this new African Resilience Investment Facility is so important. It's a 50 million fund, so it's specifically for those micro businesses that has been established. They're doing great work in South Africa, but I think that I do recognise, and the committee will recognise, that we should be very concerned, despite countries travelling out of ODA recipient status and becoming middle-income countries or less developed countries, there are a group of countries, particularly in the Horn of Africa, countries like Chad, like Sudan, countries in the Sahel like Niger, that are subject to the worst of the climate catastrophe, that are subject to the worst of conflict and malign agents, Wagner forces and others, playing a role in their country, so really affecting governance. So there are a group of countries that are incredibly fragile that will require good coordinated response. Some of that must come from multilaterals, and I've been pressing multilaterals to do more, particularly in conflict zones. But some of it will have to come from bilateral aid with partners working together. And I do recognise that in this period where countries are reducing development spend, particularly for that group of countries in the Horn of Africa, we have to be vigilant.
And if I could ask you to put that focus on groups of individuals, and I'm thinking hard to reach areas geographically. I'm thinking, again, I'm going to say this, women and girls, but also people in marginalised groups, people with disabilities. It's my concern, and I believe this committee's concern, whenever mainstreaming happens, that 95% might get access, but it's that 5% that don't have a voice that really need our support and your attention, Foreign Secretary. Can I bring Alice in, please?
Yes, just talking about Africa and financing. Obviously, we just had the Financing for Development conference in Seville. Debt was high on the agenda. It's one of the biggest things holding back particularly African countries in terms of how much they have to spend servicing their debt instead of investing in healthcare. We spoke earlier this week about the role the City of London could play, particularly. UK law governs 90% of the debt within the common framework, I believe. So could you just talk a bit about what we are doing to champion debt relief, debt restructuring for the countries that need it most?
The debt issue obviously is more complex than it was when the global community came together on debt relief when I was last in government, in part because a lot of debt is now owed to China. But you're right, it's still the case that debt remains an issue, particularly, and that is an issue that African leaders also raise with us, and that the servicing costs particularly are high. There is work that we need to do with the rating agencies that comes up time and time again, and UK leadership is required there. A fortnight ago, as you said in Seville, we welcomed the package of reforms on debt, specifically strong action to improve the voice of the debtors particularly, and debt transparency, disaster pause clauses particularly, pioneering innovations like the innovation that we've made around insurance can play a role. We did that for Caribbean countries. We saw that after Hurricane Beryl in Grenada particularly. How we put debtor countries across the global financial system. The chair had a suggestion for SIDS particularly. So that's activity. This is a work in progress. We are not there yet, and there are differences. I think there are differences across nations, particularly global north nations, on how to approach the debt issue.
I'm hearing it's on your radar, Foreign Secretary. James.
I'm conscious of time. So, Foreign Secretary, I think you spoke to the equivalent committee in the Lords in May. You referenced hosting or the potential of hosting a global conference around foreign aid and the future approach to that. Can you confirm that we are committed to doing that?
Yes.
Fantastic. And the objectives of the conference, you clear at the moment the objectives of that conference?
Well, I want to convene on the issue of coordination with other countries, obviously with parts of the global south, and obviously with some of the NGO community. It's really a future development conference in what has been a very turbulent year for development. We do need some innovation. We should be coordinated in our approach. We do need to hear this voice that we have heard through our Africa approach, but not all other nations have undertaken that sort of exercise. So we've got to bring that voice to the table. In a way, I would have liked the conference to be tomorrow, but in truth, I'm conscious that we've got UNGA, we've got COP. It's a busy autumn period, so it may be that this is towards the end of the year, the beginning of next year, to allow the space, but also to give colleagues the time really to think through the innovations that they want to see, and to recognise with the closure of USAID particularly, and with the UN reform programme and the work that Tom Fletcher's doing on the humanitarian aid piece, there is a lot of work that's happening, but we should let that work complete, come together and really refresh our global development offer. That's why I want that conference, and it should be held here in London, because we have always led on these issues.
Foreign Secretary, we're excited to hear that, and the committee's keen to help any way that we can. A few final questions from Monica. We're turning across the pond, and over to you.
Ms. Hardy.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. What has concerned you most about the very significant cut in US development spend?
Well, I did raise this with Marco Rubio. He was at pains to emphasise to me that that they would be looking at these issues through US national interests. He was at pains to emphasise to me most recently the work that they've done with Rwanda and DRC, for example. Yesterday I was speaking to colleagues in the US about my concerns about extremism in parts of the Horn of Africa. This has been very disruptive to the global aid community. That's a concern. But I am pleased that the United States is examining how it can continue to play a role, particularly in the continent of Africa.
So, Foreign Secretary, the cuts are huge, and as you say, will disrupt the provision of aid. And given that you are at pains to point out that your position or the cuts to UK aid are not ideological, are you doing anything to persuade the US to change course on, for example, the end of funding for WHO, for Gavi? They've rejected the US the Sustainable Development Goals, they've reinstated the Mexico City policy, etc. What conversations have you had about that?
My emphasis has been coordinating with partners to meet the need that we see. We will not be able, even as partners, to meet all of the need that we see. I have also, of course, made representations about my concern that other autocracies or countries that are keen to break up the rules-based order might move into some of the gaps. So of course I've made those representations, but I am confident when you see the US in areas like Somalia, as I said, the DRC, Rwanda, playing a role that we will see funds coming back into the system, but they will be coming back in a different way.
And can I reference what you've just said to other actors moving into the space? And you referenced this in your locale speech. Are you worried about the impact of USA ID cards and UKA cards in the threat from Russia and China moving into the spaces that we vacate?
Well, to be fair, China's Belt and Road Initiative started a long time before decisions made on USID. That's been a journey that's been happening for most of my political career, to be fair. And look, of course there's always going to be a role for superpowers in relation to supporting the poorest wherever they are. But there was a consensus after the Second World War that countries that largely make up the G7, European partners, did have an important role to play, not solely actually, this was a self-interested role, because often these problems find their way to our own countries. So there's self-interest here. The Americans have said that they're acting in their national interest, so they too concede that there must be some self-interest in ensuring, for example, the outbreak of pandemic affects us all. Climate affects us all. Conflict often comes back to the doors of countries who've heavily invested in defence. All of this requires action.
Foreign Secretary,